So I took the task of this forum to think about the question, how should we be writing history now, and what are the particular challenges that are posed by your particular kind of history? And I found myself thinking in two very different ways. I would say the particular, I'm getting mixed between my challenges and my thoughts about the future. It seems to me that current changes, technological changes, where we are today in our society, leads me to the position where I think that we historians ought to be very, very attuned to the visual. I think we live in a visual society. I think we live in a society where people are used to seeing things on websites, in PowerPoints, on TV. This is the generation, the world we live in. And I think historians should be utilizing the visual as much as they can in their writing, let alone in their teaching. So in writing, maps, charts, images would be the way to go to get across to your reader what you want that reader to do. And I think all of us historians basically want our readers to empathize and understand the society that we study on their own terms. The problem for me is, however, that the society I study is remarkably different from the society that we live in the modern day, because it's not a modern society, it's an early modern society, it's almost a non-Western society, terribly different, and following my own advice, there's nothing visual that I can use in the particular topics I'm doing research on right now to help me get a vision of that society across to the people who might possibly read my research. My research is on the practice of the criminal law that is in early Russia, 17th century, early 18th century. And there are just no images produced in Muscovy about that topic. At a time when in Europe is awash with graphic and violent images of public executions and legal procedures and lots of daily life and things like that. Muscovy was a non-secular society. Every creative impulse that was allowed to be expressed in art was religious. Every surviving, practically 90% of surviving, 99% surviving architecture from those centuries is religious, it's churches. So that for my teaching I can bring the visual in on the more general issues, but there's nothing that I can use like images of executions or floggings or such to help my students kind of understand the society I'm studying. And even the foreign travelers who went to Russia didn't leave back much imagery as well. So I am finding myself falling back on the old standby of historians that you've probably heard before, which is that I think the way to write now for people in fields like mine is that you have to paint images in words. You have to make word pictures to capture the imagination and penetrate the understanding of your audience. So that's sort of what I want to talk to you about how I try to do that in my writing. So first of all, I want to leave aside for a moment the question of how we historians reach the point where we feel like we've understood our society accurately, which when you're dealing with pre-modern societies, that's always a big question. You don't want to modernize and anachronize the society you're studying. So I'll leave aside how we try to do that and assume that we've got an accurate understanding that I now as a writer want to convey to my readers. I want to get my readers to have an empathetic understanding of the historical past. And by empathetic, I mean it in two ways. One way, I want them to understand that the past is understandable because it's full of people like us who, in many ways, really have common humanity like ours. And at the very same time, I want them to understand the past as something very different and necessarily so very different from ours. And I want them to empathize and understand with both of those perspectives. And certainly 17th century Muscovy is a very, very different society in terms of social values, life opportunities, life experiences, that sort of thing, social structures than the society we live in. So on the one hand, I want to use my writing to get people to understand the society as it was. That's the macro level that John talked about before. At the same time, we historians are called upon to do more than just to talk about historical reality in its own terms. We need to make sense of the past. We're called to make perceived patterns and structures, and we do that by engaging in debates with other historians and posing theoretical issues and things like that. So, for example, in my work on the criminal law, I want to study how the law worked in practice in order to engage in a very big interpretive debate in my field about autocracy and despotism and the nature of Russian government. So what I have tended to do to accomplish all of these goals, micro and macro, is to seek out sources that will allow me to tell stories. Basically, I'm back to telling stories to exemplify the history I want to get across. And there are two kinds of stories that I look for when I go through my sources to try to get people to have a deeper understanding of the past. I use stories from court cases because even though they have their formulaic limitations, I think they're as close as we're going to get to verbatim Muscovites talking as anything else that's left in the historical record of Muscovy, that's for sure. So the two kinds of stories that I look for, some that show fundamentally similar human behavior that we can identify with, and some of those that are the sort that make us laugh or giggle or wince. You know, I'm always on the lookout for things in the past that we seem, that on initial impression we think of as a little strange. I think that's where you should stop and pause and start digging, because you'll find something interesting there. So I want to give you two stories, examples of both types of historical moments. So the first story. 1646, in a small frontier town called Kozlov on the border southeast of Moscow on the steppe. This is from my criminal law research. A peasant woman from the province confesses to intentionally murdering her husband. Why? She had good reason. He was her second husband, she had young children from a previous marriage, and he had raped her 8-year-old daughter. So she plotted with her son-in-law to kill him, and they did. So the judge, in principle, had an open and shut case. The law said intentional murder, death penalty. But he was also required to do an investigation of the community to find out if there were any more conspirators in this crime. So he surveyed the community, not for eyewitness. There wasn't any more eyewitnesses than the two perpetrators, but for character witness. That was okay in this judicial system, character witness, and he got an earful. He heard from people all across the village that she was a good woman and the husband was a terrible man. He was lecherous. They said he had probably killed his other 2 wives in abusive beatings because they'd complained about his sexual meanderings in the village, and the community was happy to be rid of him. So the judge, who is not a local man, he's appointed from Moscow, recognizing community opinion, lets her and her son off of the death penalty. They get a sentence of a flogging, which is not nothing, but it's certainly they can survive it, particularly as administered on the local level. The judge might have told them to go a little easy. So as a reader, you can instantly empathize with a story like this. This is a woman who loved her daughter enough to commit murder. So this is real human beings with real feelings of love. Aren't we all alike? This is good. You know, my students love stories like this because you can see that you can empathize with people who do this sort of thing. It's also a community disgusted with sexual abuse. We can understand that. But you can also use this story to show your reader ways in which the society is somewhat different from ours. For example, she obviously didn't love this husband, and there's good reason for it, beyond his horrendous behavior. You can use this story to open up a discussion about marriage in peasant communities, which in peasant communities in 17th century Russia, they wouldn't have allowed a woman like her, widowed with children, to be alone and widowed in the community. They would have married her up to some man, also probably widowed, in the community who needed a wife and a family to support his plot of land. And the village, by marrying her and him together, then would have assured their ability to pay their annual taxes. So this is traditional society, not at all like the society we live in, so that you can turn this story in both ways. And finally, you can go up to a more macro level of interpretation and use this story to talk a little bit about the judicial system. First of all, that this is this tells you a little bit about concepts of justice in Muscovy, that people believed in justice and fairness as opposed to the letter of the law. And the surprising thing to those of us who initially study Muscovy is that the judge had the discretion to accommodate community feeling and to change the sentencing. So that gives you an interesting perspective on autocracy and provides me some ammunition in these debates against people who call Muscovy a mere despotism. So that's one kind of story that I think helps us empathize with these people on the ground. The second story I want to tell you is one of those historical moments that get you shaking your head and wondering what is going on here. This story seems kind of funny at first. So here's that story. These are high-ranking boyars, the Tsar's men, in the Kremlin court, all having dinner together. They serve together. They're judges together. They're the most important people in the community. So one of them, a boyar, refuses to sit next to another boyar at the Tsar's banquet, saying it's insulting because his family is more eminent than the other man's family, and he won't sit. He certainly wouldn't serve with him. He won't sit next to him. And the Tsar, Alexei Mikhailovich, orders him to do so, and he refuses, and they hold him at the table. This is actually documented in Muscovite sources. They hold him at the table, and he slumps under the table to fall onto the floor, so that he doesn't have to be recorded as being present in that banquet sitting next to that person there. And so the next day they take it to court, and the Tsar hears them out. And the Tsar rules that the recalcitrant man is wrong, that the other man's family does outrank him, and that he should serve with him, and that the Tsar's initial seating arrangement was accurate. The losing boyar does not accept this verdict. He's humiliated. It's important to him. He refuses to serve. He refuses to go to the court. He sits at home. Everybody knows the boyar's not coming to attend, and the Tsar, it's a big scandal. The Tsar gets very angry. So he forces the loser to go through a ritual in order to finish this once and for all. So this kind of rank consciousness is, you can find it in lots of aristocratic monarchical courts in Europe, in early modern Europe, but not quite this kind of ritual that I'm about to describe to you. It seems pretty unique and remarkable in the Russian setting. So here's how it plays out. The Tsar orders his staff to take the loser man and to lead him on foot, which is a mark of dishonor in this elite, into the courtyard of the winning person. And he has sent ahead to that winning boyar to tell him to expect their arrival. So when they arrive, the host steps out onto his veranda, and he looks down at the inferior man standing in the courtyard. And then the Tsar's state secretary, who had accompanied the loser, reads out a proclamation affirming that the Tsar has sent this man to him because the loser has dishonored the superior man by his recalcitrance. So at this point in the story, we moderns might expect a kind of an apology from the loser and a gracious acceptance from the winner and a handshake and bygones be bygones, and they move ahead. That's not how it plays out at all. It's so interesting. Two things happen. Each side has a scripted role to play. The superior man thanks the state secretary for the Tsar's favor. He dismisses the loser without a word, and he distributes gifts to the attendants of the Tsar who have come. And then the next day he goes to the Kremlin court to personally thank the Tsar for such a favor. Meanwhile, what about the loser? No apology, not at all. This loser is allowed to stand there and insult and curse and heap all manner of verbal abuse on that superior man. He does it while he's walking across town to anyone who will listen, and he does it in the man's very presence in his own courtyard in front of everybody. And the host is not allowed to say a thing to him, to touch him or to rough him up or anything. He's supposed to just ignore it. And if he did react to the inferior man's insults, he would, this is what the source says, he would be punished doubly because he dishonors not the man who has been sent to him, but actually the Tsar himself. So here on the one hand is a kind of a nonsensical drama making, inexplicable. The vindicated man has to suffer more public abuse, and the insulting man doesn't have to apologize. But you can help your readers to see that there's a logic in this drama. It's a ritual of humiliation. Sorry, let me finish up this story quick. It's a drama that tells us a lot about important social values. Honor is very important, social hierarchy is very important, and the Tsar is the font of all favor and benefits in this society. And it's a story that gets us back to the story, the sort of the bottom line of the story before, social equilibrium. The loser, by being able to vent, is probably able, hopefully, to walk away and finally feel like he has closure to this, and each side is sort of evened out in their relationships together. So the last few words I want to say is about that last point, an earlier point I made, which is that stories are great. They're entertaining, but we historians are called to write, to make sense of stories in terms of larger issues. The cautionary reflections that I had when I was thinking about this presentation basically is that that readers that we are called by, as historians, to speak to the macro, but we shouldn't encumber our readers with that too much. I think it's highly important for us to write history now in a way that makes the story soar. I think our readers give us credit. They want us to hear us opening vistas on the past, perspectives on real people, and I think we need to write with a light touch, acknowledge the historiography, get it done within your footnotes or whatever, but really use your history writing to connect your stories from micro to macro to create people with an empathetic understanding about the familiarity and the alienness of the past. Thank you very much.